Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going back to the 1930s to Ethiopia. A story of incredible courage and resilience unfolded there. And we're going to dive into Prevail, the inspiring story of Ethiopia's victory over Mussolini's invasion.
This book is really something special. It's not your typical dry historical account. It's packed with personal stories and unexpected twists. And the level of detail that the book goes into really pulls you into the heart of the conflict.
Okay, so let me set the scene for our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
It's Ethiopia in the 1930s,
Yeah.
and the country is led by Emperor Haile Selassie. He's really trying to modernize the nation. And at the same time, you have Benito Mussolini. He's the dictator of Italy. And Mussolini has these huge dreams of recreating a Roman Empire. Talk about a clash of ambitions.
And those ambitions collide at a place called Wal. It's a seemingly insignificant spot on the map, but it becomes the flashpoint for a much larger conflict.
The Wal incident, right? It sounds almost accidental, like a spark in a powder keg.
Yeah. It might seem that way at first glance, but the truth is that tensions had been building for years. Italy had been eyeing Ethiopia for quite a while, and this border clash in 1934 gave them the excuse they needed.
But wait a minute, there was a treaty of friendship between Italy and Ethiopia. They signed it in 1928, just a few years earlier. Doesn't that count for anything?
Well, that's the thing about international agreements. They're only as good as the intentions behind them. And Mussolini saw that treaty as nothing more than a stepping stone. It was just a way to gain a foothold in the region. So when the Wal incident happened, he basically just ignored the treaty and used it as a pretext for invasion.
So much for diplomacy. What about the other European powers at the time, like Britain and France? Weren't they supposed to uphold international law?
You would think, wouldn't you? But this is where it gets even more frustrating. Both Britain and France were more concerned with their own interests in the region, particularly their colonial holdings. So instead of condemning Italy's aggression, they actually appeased Mussolini. They were hoping to avoid a larger conflict.
So they basically threw Ethiopia under the bus, just to protect their own empires. And what about the League of Nations? Wasn't their whole purpose to prevent wars like this?
In theory, yes. The League of Nations was supposed to be this international peacekeeping body, but in practice, it was totally toothless. They condemned Italy's actions and imposed some sanctions, but ultimately they did nothing to stop the invasion.
So it was a complete failure.
Pretty much. The League's inability to protect Ethiopia really exposed its limitations and contributed to its eventual downfall. It became a symbol of the impotence of international institutions in the face of aggression by powerful nations.
This whole situation just seems so unjust. You have a nation that's trying to modernize and find its place in the world, and then it just gets steamrolled by a dictator with dreams of empire, and no one steps in to help.
And you have to remember the context of the time. This was the 1930s, a period when racial biases were deeply ingrained in how the world viewed Africa.
Right, Prevail digs into this. It talks about how some in the West actually saw Ethiopia as a backward nation, one that needed to be civilized by a European power.
It's appalling. But that was the prevailing attitude among some at the time. They couldn't even fathom an independent modern African nation. It challenged their whole worldview.
But it wasn't all just acceptance and silence. The book also talks about a groundswell of support for Ethiopia, especially from African Americans.
Absolutely. For many Black Americans, the conflict resonated deeply. They saw it as a fight against colonialism, a struggle for African liberation. They organized rallies and raised funds. Some even tried to volunteer to fight alongside the Ethiopians.
That's incredible, that level of solidarity crossing oceans and continents. It shows just how deeply this conflict resonated with people, far beyond Ethiopia's borders.
And this wasn't just symbolic support. The book tells the story of John Robinson. He was an African-American pilot who traveled to Ethiopia to help train Ethiopian pilots and maintain their aircraft.
Now that's what I call putting your skills where your heart is. What was Robinson's experience like? Was he able to make a difference?
Robinson faced immense challenges. The Ethiopian Air Force was small and ill-equipped. They had outdated planes that were constantly breaking down. And he was also working in a completely foreign environment, facing cultural differences and language barriers.
It sounds like an uphill battle.
It was. And sadly, Robinson's efforts were ultimately hampered by limited resources and the sheer technological superiority of the Italian Air Force. But his story really highlights the courage and determination of those who stood with Ethiopia during its darkest hour.
Speaking of challenges, I can't imagine the Ethiopians had much of a chance against the Italian military. Wasn't there a huge mismatch in terms of technology and firepower?
The difference was staggering. The Italians had modern tanks, artillery, and aircraft, along with a well-trained and equipped army. The Ethiopians, on the other hand, relied heavily on outdated weapons and traditional fighting methods.
So we're talking spears versus tanks. That's hardly a fair fight.
It wasn't. But despite being vastly outmatched, the Ethiopians fought with incredible bravery and tenacity. The book recounts numerous stories of individual acts of heroism, soldiers and civilians alike who refused to back down, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
That's the kind of resilience that really gets to you. Knowing you're facing such a powerful enemy, yet still choosing to resist, there must have been moments of sheer terror.
There were, and Prevail doesn't shy away from the brutality of the conflict. One of the most chilling aspects is the Italian use of poison gas against Ethiopian troops and civilians.
Wait, poison gas? That's a war crime.
It was a horrific violation of international law. The Italians used mustard gas. It's a debilitating and often deadly chemical weapon. They used it indiscriminately against both military targets and civilian populations.
That's just inhumane. It shows how far Mussolini was willing to go to achieve his ambitions. But even in the face of such barbarity, the Ethiopians continued to resist. Are there any particular stories of defiance that stood out to you?
One that comes to mind is the story of Ras Imru. He was a cousin and close confidant of Emperor Haile Selassie. During the Italian occupation, he and his family were forced to go into hiding. They spent months living in their own stables to avoid capture. It's a testament to the lengths Ethiopians went to just to survive.
Hiding in your own home. That just paints a vivid picture of the fear and uncertainty. That must have gripped the nation. And it makes you wonder about those who were captured. What happened to Ethiopian prisoners of war?
Prevail delves into the grim reality of Italian prison camps, where captured Ethiopian soldiers faced appalling conditions. They were subjected to malnourishment disease and brutal treatment. Many didn't survive.
It's heartbreaking to think about the suffering they endured. It's a stark reminder that behind the grand narratives of war, there are countless individual stories of lost resilience and unimaginable hardship.
Exactly. And that's what makes this book so powerful. It doesn't just recount battles and political maneuvers. It gives voice to the experiences of those who lived through the conflict, both the famous and the ordinary.
So we've got this clash of personalities, these massive military mismatches, and a backdrop of global indifference and even outright racism. It's a lot to take in. But before we get to the outcome of the conflict, I want to dive deeper into some of the key figures who shaped these events.
I'm with you on that. Understanding their motivations and actions is key to unraveling the complexities of this period.
Let's start with Haile Selassie. He's often seen as a symbol of African resistance, but he was also a complex and sometimes controversial figure. What did the book reveal about his leadership during this crisis?
Haile Selassie was a man caught between two worlds. He was deeply committed to modernizing Ethiopia, but he was also steeped in tradition, navigating a delicate balance between reforming his nation and maintaining his authority within a system that had existed for centuries.
It sounds like a tough balancing act, and all while facing the threat of invasion.
Exactly. And you see this tension play out in his actions. He appealed to the League of Nations for help, hoping to rally international support against Italy. But at the same time, he was preparing for war, mobilizing his forces and trying to rally his people.
So a mix of diplomacy and defiance.
Precisely. And ultimately, he made the agonizing decision to go into exile. When it became clear that Ethiopia couldn't withstand the Italian onslaught, it was a controversial choice, with some criticizing him for abandoning his people. But others saw it as a strategic move, a way to preserve the Ethiopian monarchy and continue the fight from abroad.
It's easy to judge from a distance, but I can't imagine the pressure he was under. Then you have Mussolini, driven by his ego and his obsession with restoring Roman glory. What did the book reveal about his motivations and his role in the conflict?
Mussolini saw Ethiopia as a prize, a jewel to add to his imagined empire. He craved recognition as a powerful leader on the world stage, and conquering Ethiopia was a way to prove himself, to show that Italy was a force to be reckoned with.
So it was more about his ego than any strategic value Ethiopia might have held.
To a large extent, yes. But there were also economic motives. Italy lacked natural resources, and Mussolini saw Ethiopia as a source of raw materials and cheap labor.
It's almost like a throwback to the days of colonialism, exploiting a weaker nation for its own gain.
In many ways it was, and Mussolini's ruthlessness is evident in his willingness to use any means necessary to achieve victory, including poison gas and brutal reprisals against civilian populations.
It's chilling to think about the level of cruelty involved. Are there any other key figures from the Italian side that stand out?
One who deserves mention is Rodolfo Graziani, an Italian general known for his brutality. He was responsible for a number of massacres and atrocities during the conflict, including the horrific Addis Ababa massacre in 1937, where thousands of Ethiopians were slaughtered in retaliation for an attempted assassination of the Italian viceroy.
It's a dark chapter in history, a reminder of the horrors that can unfold when power is unchecked.
Indeed. But alongside these figures of darkness, Prevail also highlights the bravery and ingenuity of those who fought against Italian aggression both on the battlefield and behind the scenes.
And that's where things get really interesting,
No.
right? Because this wasn't just a conventional war. There was a whole underground resistance movement that played a pivotal role in challenging Italian occupation.
Absolutely. And that's a story for our next deep dive. We'll explore the intricate web of resistance that emerged, the daring tactics they employed, and the unexpected heroes who emerged from the shadows.
Sounds like we're just getting started.
We talked about the stark power imbalance, the brutal realities of the Italian invasion, but what Prevail really brings to light is the Ethiopian resistance. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a nationwide uprising, a fight for survival that was woven into the fabric of everyday life.
That's what makes this story so compelling. We often hear about grand battles and political strategies. But what about the people on the ground facing occupation? How did they resist?
Well, imagine this vast and rugged landscape of Ethiopia. You have dense forests, soaring mountains, and the Italians, despite their superior weaponry, couldn't control it all.
It's like trying to hold on to water, right? No matter how tightly you grasp, some of it always slips through your fingers.
Exactly. And that's where the Ethiopian resistance thrived. They knew the terrain, they had the element of surprise, and they were driven by a deep love for their homeland.
The book talks about this young resistance leader, Jagamakilo. He was barely an adult when the Italians invaded, and yet he ends up commanding thousands of warriors. What made him such an effective leader?
Jagama was this charismatic figure. He was a natural leader who emerged from the chaos. He was known for his bravery and his tactical brilliance, and his ability to inspire those around him. He embodied the spirit of resistance.
I can just picture him leading these daring raids, outsmarting the Italians at every turn. It's like something out of a movie.
It's pretty cinematic. He used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, disrupting supply lines, ambushing patrols. He was a constant thorn in the side of the Italian forces.
What's fascinating is that you have this blend of traditional warfare, warriors armed with spears and swords, fighting alongside those who had managed to acquire more modern weapons.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that Prevail highlights so well. It wasn't just about military tactics. It was about resilience, adaptation, and using whatever means necessary to fight for your freedom.
So you have these individual acts of defiance, these legendary figures like Jagamakelo, but the book also talks about a more organized resistance movement, right?
It does, and it's important to remember that this wasn't a monolithic resistance. There were various groups, sometimes with conflicting ideologies, but all united by the common goal of driving out the Italians.
So a patchwork of resistance, each group with its own leaders, tactics, and areas of operation.
Exactly. You had groups loyal to Emperor Haile Selassie operating in the south and west, coordinating with British forces. Then you had groups in the north, led by figures like Ras Abebe Aregai and Ras Mulujeta Yagazu, who had their own power bases and often operated independently.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare trying to coordinate all these different factions.
It certainly presented challenges. There were rivalries, disagreements over strategy, and sometimes even clashes between different resistance groups.
So internal divisions within the resistance, that must have complicated things.
It did. But despite these challenges, the resistance managed to inflict significant damage on the Italian forces, tying down troops, disrupting supply lines, and making it clear that Italian control over Ethiopia was far from secure.
It's a testament to their determination, even when facing a superior enemy and dealing with internal disagreements. But eventually, the World War expands, and Ethiopia becomes part of a much larger conflict. What happens then?
Well, with Italy joining the Axis powers, Ethiopia becomes strategically important to the Allies. They need to secure the Red Sea and prevent the Axis from gaining a foothold in East Africa.
So Ethiopia becomes a battleground in the fight against fascism.
Exactly. And this leads to a fascinating chapter in the war, the Allied campaign to liberate Ethiopia. You have British forces pushing up from Kenya, supported by South African, Indian, and other Allied troops. But a key part of this campaign is the role played by Ethiopian patriot forces.
These are the resistance fighters we've been talking about, right? Now they have the backing of the Allies.
That's right. They provide crucial intelligence, guide Allied troops through the treacherous terrain, and engage in guerrilla warfare against the Italians.
It sounds like a game changer, having these local forces who know the land and are deeply invested in the outcome of the fight.
It was, and a central figure in this campaign is a British officer named Orde Wingate. He's a bit of a maverick, known for his unconventional tactics and his deep respect for the Ethiopian fighters.
Wingate, wasn't he the one who led the Chindits in Burma? Those legendary jungle fighters?
The very same. He's a fascinating character, brilliant, but also eccentric. And he brings his unique brand of warfare to Ethiopia. He recognizes the value of the Ethiopian patriot forces, their knowledge of the land, their fighting spirit, and he integrates them into his strategy.
So it's not just the Allies dictating the terms of the fight. There's this collaboration, this recognition of the Ethiopians' role in their own liberation.
Precisely. Wingate forms this special unit called Gideon Force, made up of British and Ethiopian troops, trained in guerrilla warfare hit-and-run tactics, exploiting the Italians' weaknesses.
It sounds like a perfect match. Wingate's unconventional thinking and the Ethiopians' fighting prowess, what kind of impact did they have?
They wreaked havoc. They disrupted supply lines, ambushed convoys, demoralized the Italian troops. They were instrumental in the Allied advance, paving the way for the eventual liberation of Addis Ababa.
And amidst all of this, Emperor Haile Selassie returns from exile. What a symbolic moment that must have been.
It was an incredibly powerful moment. Haile Selassie re-enters Addis Ababa in 1941, 5 years after being forced into exile. He rides through the streets on a white horse, a symbol of Ethiopian resilience, a living testament to the fact that they had never truly surrendered.
It's a powerful image. The exiled emperor returning to reclaim his throne. But I imagine the war left deep scars, both physical and psychological. How did Ethiopia begin to heal after such a traumatic experience?
The process of rebuilding was long and arduous. There's the immediate challenge of dealing with the aftermath of war, the destruction, the displacement, the loss of life. Then there's the task of reasserting Ethiopian sovereignty, dismantling the remnants of Italian rule, and reestablishing a sense of national unity after years of occupation and internal conflict.
So it wasn't just about rebuilding infrastructure, it was about rebuilding a nation, a sense of identity.
Exactly, and that's where things get even more complex. The war had exposed the limitations of Ethiopia's traditional power structures. There were calls for reform, for modernization, for greater political participation. Haile Selassie, while hailed as a liberator, now faced the challenge of navigating these demands, balancing his desire for control with the aspirations of his people.
It sounds like the war, while a victory for Ethiopian independence, also unleashed a wave of social and political change that would continue to shape the country's future.
It did. And this is where Prevail takes a deeper look. It delves into the post-war period, exploring the challenges Haile Selassie faced, the political maneuvering, the attempts to reconcile with the past, and the ongoing quest for justice.
Justice for the atrocities committed, the war crimes, the use of poison gas. Did those responsible ever face accountability?
That's a complicated and unfortunately often frustrating story. While there were some efforts to bring Italian war criminals to justice, the political realities of the post-war world, particularly the emerging Cold War, made it difficult to achieve full accountability.
So realpolitik trumps justice.
In many ways, yes. The focus shifted to rebuilding Europe, to containing the Soviet Union. And sadly, the crimes committed in Ethiopia, as horrific as they were, became a footnote in the larger narrative of the 20th century.
It's a reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied. But even if the perpetrators escaped full accountability, the story of Ethiopia's resistance stands as a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure, to fight for what's right, and to ultimately prevail.
And that's what makes this book so powerful. It's not just a history lesson. It's a story of courage, resilience, and the enduring fight for freedom.
So the Italians are driven out, Haile Selassie returns, and you'd think, okay, happy ending, right. But as we've been learning, history is rarely that simple. What happens to Ethiopia after the war? How does a nation rebuild after going through something so traumatic?
It's a fascinating and complex period. Ethiopia enters this phase of rapid modernization, but it's heavily influenced by the years of Italian occupation. It's like this forced evolution, trying to catch up to a world that moved on while they were fighting for survival.
And you have Haile Selassie back in power. But now he's leading a nation that's gone through a crucible. Did that change him, change his approach to leadership?
The book delves into this, and it's not always a flattering portrait. Haile Selassie, despite his image as a liberator, became increasingly authoritarian. He centralized power, suppressed dissent, almost as if the war had made him more determined to control the narrative, to shape Ethiopia's future according to his vision.
It's like that saying, power corrupts.
Yeah.
But was it all about maintaining control, or was there a genuine desire to modernize, to lift Ethiopia out of poverty and into the modern world?
It was likely a mix of both. Prevail highlights his efforts to improve education healthcare infrastructure. He wanted Ethiopia to be seen as a modern nation, a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. But he also wanted to be the one calling the shots, the architect of this new Ethiopia.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? Modernization often brings social and political changes, demands for more participation, more freedom. How did the Ethiopian people respond to all of this?
There was growing unrest, especially among the younger generation. They saw the inequalities, the concentration of power, the gap between Haile Selassie's rhetoric and the realities on the ground. This eventually culminated in the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974, which overthrew the monarchy and ushered in a period of even more radical change.
So the very leader who had symbolized resistance against fascism ends up being overthrown by a revolution. It's a stark reminder that history is full of ironies.
It is, and it raises important questions about the complexities of leadership, the challenges of post-colonial nation-building, and how even the most well-intentioned leaders can become out of touch with the aspirations of their people.
We've talked a lot about the political and military aspects, but what about the lasting impact on Ethiopian society? How did this conflict shape their culture, their identity?
That's a question Prevail really grapples with. The war instilled a deep sense of national pride, a recognition of their strength and resilience. It also highlighted the importance of unity, of setting aside differences to fight for a common cause. But there were also scars: the trauma of violence, the loss of loved ones, the disruption of traditional ways of life.
It's like this collective memory, a shared experience that continues to shape how Ethiopians view themselves and their place in the world.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the legacies of conflict extend far beyond political boundaries or economic indicators. They shape the very soul of a nation.
This has been an incredible journey, a deep dive into a period of history that's often overlooked. But Prevail brings it to life in a way that's both informative and deeply moving.
It does. It's a testament to the power of storytelling, of weaving together historical facts with personal narratives to create a truly immersive experience.
If you're looking to expand your understanding of African history, the fight against colonialism, or just incredible stories of courage and resilience, Prevail is a must-read. You can find a link to purchase the book using our affiliate link in the episode description. By using our link, you'll be supporting the show and helping us continue to bring you these fascinating deep dives.
And trust me, you won't regret diving into this one. It's a story that will stay with you long after you finish the last page.
Until next time, keep exploring.